everyone. I hope you can hear me. I am Sarah Meister. I'm Aperture's executive director, and I'm so glad that without my even prompting, many of you are already chiming in from where you are tuning in from. I see France, but keep on letting us know New Orleans. This is great. Evan and Hal and I are tuning in from London, San Francisco, and New York. So we've got many, many time zones covered and thrilled that there are more. New Hampshire, New York City, California, Seattle. I love all the people who woke up early. Good work. Um, Lake Tahoe, I recognize that name. Cupertino. Anyway, we're thrilled you all are here to join us today for the, I think, did it say 23rd episode of the Aperture PhotoBook Club? Kind of hard to believe. Hi, Erin O'Toole. We're glad you're joining. So today, the Aperture PhotoBook Club is an opportunity for us to get together and talk about books we love and why we love them with the brilliant people who were associated with their making. And for this conversation, I'm thrilled to be joined by the writer and critic, Evan Moffitt, by the artist and critic, Hal Fischer, and we are missing two people who we might normally have in this conversation, but this just allows us to say wonderful things about them and embarrass them in their absence. And I'll begin with our amazing senior editor, Brendan Emser, who was the editor of this book. And when he introduced Hal recently at a launch event in New York, he did it so succinctly and so fantastically. I thought I would just quote him here. So Brendan noted, Aperture is a nonprofit publisher founded in 1952 and focused especially on photography. Early and often, our founders were ambitious about the idea of combining words and pictures, setting in dialogue intelligent writing with the most important photography of the day. In this respect, Brendan, and I agree, can think of no better exponent of the literalization of words and pictures than Hal Fischer, whose series, Gay Semiotics from 1977, is a legendary work of image text art that manages to be at once a documentary study of gay sartorial identities in post-Stonewall San Francisco from the jock to the hippie, a sexy typology of queer media images and S&M predilections, a bittersweet time capsule of an insouciant, all too brief moment of liberation before the onset of the AIDS epidemic, and a charmingly sly how-to guide to cruising. So we'll dive into all that and more in a moment. But thank you, Brendan, for editing this book so beautifully and launching our events off right. I do want to just also take a moment. While you should chime in the chat where you're from, please also don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. And I also want to thank Photo Focus, who are our sponsors of the Photo Book Club and have been for the last 4 years. Their support makes this beautiful production possible, and we're really very grateful for it. So let's get going. And Hal, we usually like to begin with a little flip through of the book for anyone who doesn't have the pleasure of holding it in their hands yet. And maybe you'd talk us through what we're seeing as we're seeing it.
Let's start with the cover of the book. I should start actually by prefacing this that this whole book is not what I expect. By the way, that's me in my underwear at
We're going
23.
to get back to that.
Oh, we're going back to my underwear. Good.
Yeah, we'll go back. We're definitely going back to
Okay.
that.
This was not the book I ever expected that would occur. And it started actually that Aperture, Brendan, my editor, wanted to see everything that I'd ever done. And so all of a sudden, and this is my fourth book, we have a book that's a retrospective of my work, and with the addition of some incredible text, the core of which was a series of essays that came out of a symposium on my work at the University of Illinois, and then the addition of an essay by the critic Jared Ernst, and an interview with me by Evan Moffitt, who's here, as well as an essay that I had done for my previous book. So seeing all of this together in one place was kind of stunning to me. It was actually stunningly uncomfortable at the same time because I, being a critic, am actually quite harsh on my own work. And I was like, oh, we're showing my early work. Um, I mean, but I totally put my trust in Aperture that we were, going to move forward. And I was very comfortable with what they thought about things. So one of the things that I think sets this book apart is just, first of all, how much writing is in it. I think that when I look at it, the book is a biography of me in a lot of ways, and it's a wonderful biography in how non-linear it is. And so there's little bits of pieces of me, and my career's always been problematic for me because I started as a photographer, as an artist. Then I started writing criticism. Then I did both. Then I only did criticism. And then I decided I wanted to support myself. And I left all of that and went into a museum career. And interesting, I was just asked to put all that together in a statement and write about the how these things all work together, which I never thought they did, and then I realized they actually did in terms of that. My work is very much about everything I've done in my career is really about a kind of communication of how you make things accessible. And so I finally understood how gay semiotics, done in 1977, and my 2002 retrospective of an Italian Renaissance artist who died in 1531, his first one person show, actually connected because both of them are really about I want to reveal things in the good old not so good old days before we got a little more sensitive. We would have called this interpretation, but we don't call things interpretation anymore of museums and anywhere else. And I realized that I'm not doing interpretation. I'm opening a portal. I'm opening a way of seeing things. And one of the things we probably we could talk about when we go through the book, but there's a progression in my work. Um, that again, it's funny after look at these things and seeing them and think about them more. There's almost a progression of intimacy in my photo works, all
Well,
the way.
hold on. Wait, yes, there is. And speaking of portals, I think actually one of the great portals into your work was this interview that you did with Evan. So Evan, we actually rarely invite somebody who contributed to the book to uh, to be a part of the photo book club because we feel like you said it, you did your interview, but I actually wonder you did really offer a unique portal into Hal through that conversation, and maybe you've contributed to Aperture frequently in a number of other contexts, but maybe you talk about that portal for us.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here. I mean, it's always been a pleasure to contribute to Aperture. You make such beautiful books, and of course the magazine. But it was also a special pleasure to get to know you better, Hal, and to know your work better. Um, I A lot of that early work was also a revelation to me, and I think we had some good fun. I hope you can you can sense that in the text. I first came across your work. What feels like not all that long ago, actually, at an exhibition at Cherry and Martin in Los Angeles in 2015, and I was just beginning my own career as a critic. And the magazine Gay Letter had just come out, and so I wrote a short thing about the exhibition for them. Um, and uh, and I experienced a kind of twofold recognition looking at it. Of course, there was the identification with a kind of gay history that um, I maybe wasn't fully able to access as someone who came of age after the advent of dating apps and the kind of um, the the move of cruising culture online. Um, but I also, I'm a big fan of writers like John Rishi, and I'd been trying to access that history and to kind of try and understand my culture a bit better. But I was also, I just recently graduated from the art history program at UCLA, and I had been studying semiotics, and I had been really keenly interested in the politics of representation. And so these two things were working together in a way that that had a real humor and humanity that I hadn't really seen before in other works. I mean, a really seminal work, I think, in my early days studying art history was Martha Rosler's The Bowery into Inadequate Descriptive Systems, in which she pairs these photographs of storefronts on the Bowery with words for intoxication. And these two systems, even when put together, really fail to give you a sense of the human, of an experience of of poverty and addiction. Um, and I think in gay semiotics, you'd get that, but also there's a kind of subversive quality to the language, a sense of irony layered onto it. So yeah, it really, I mean, it resonated with me immediately. Um, I've forgotten your question, but
Well, no, that was the portal. You gave it. That
Yeah.
was it. I was looking for the word. And maybe let's set the scene a little bit for some of our viewers who, you know, don't sort of realize what it might have meant to have moved to San Francisco in 1975 and what it meant, to have Harvey Milk come to a book signing for gay semiotics. And there's a great, pick snapshot from that in the book. So maybe Hal, just like you and Evan did in your interview and as you did in your introduction, like help us set this scene of semiotics and the sort of the world of the Castro in the mid 70s.
Okay.
Just an
Uh,
easy thing but you were there, so you
I
can.
was there, and it was a period of a lot. It was an easier way of life in the 70s in general. I remember, I think my very first perception, and again, back up, I moved to San Francisco to go into the MA program in photography at San Francisco State. Because one of the kind of myths that I followed the traditional trajectory of, the gay man or wannabe gay man fleeing his home to go have freedom in San Francisco. That actually isn't what happened. I mean, I had made the decision I wanted to be in an urban environment, but I hadn't selected San Francisco precisely. That's where I ended up going to graduate school. Um, but at that point, San Francisco, I remember my first time driving around and seeing the Castro. What shocked me was there were all these people on the street in the middle of the day, in the sidewalks, people just hanging out. And I had come from these Midwestern environments and these very kind of like, you get up, people go to the work for the whole day, and then they come home and da-da. And all of a sudden, there's all these people on the sidewalk. What are they doing? Probably 70% of them were waiters, but what did I know at that point? So all of a sudden, I realized it's a very, very different place. I mean, on every level, lifestyle, even just from the standpoint of image making, I was this environment with a whole different kind of light than I was used to, which was really, really shocking to me, and particularly because my last body of work was in the landscape. Last body before I came out for graduate school was the landscape work
Right.
in Pennsylvania. So, and there we are with the Castro. Uh, so,
And does it just to give a sense of these are people that you're seeing as you're walking on the streets, right? I mean,
well, it that you would see those people on the street, and certainly the one on the right. I mean, he is actually one of the only people in the book that did not start out as a friend or an acquaintance. I literally found him on a Sunday standing outside of the hot brunch place, the Patio Cafe, and I go, "Oh my God, yes, I really need him for a model." I think everyone else in the book is either someone I knew or the classical archetype, where I sent people on a search for the uh, best posterior they could find, and I'm proud of that. Posterior was featured in the camp show at the Met in a room with Thomas Akins, my nemesis Robert Mapplethorpe, and some Hellenic uh, sculpture on shocking pink walls. That was a treat.
Actually, speaking of your nemesis, I think this is another thing that I would, and before we sort of turn to the book, both you and Evan write for a living. You support yourselves as critics. And I think your willingness to put forward perhaps an opinion that might go against the grain of even some of your friends and acquaintance, even Lou Thomas, you wrote some fairly critical things about your first show of his. So maybe would each of you speak a little bit to either for Hal, for you, your writing, and Evan, as Evan asked you, how you think that connects to your art? Because while this is really a book of your photography, um, I loved that Jared Everett noted, he said in his essay, between 1975 and 1980, Fisher made a handful of rigorously conceptualized and meticulously realized photo series. In striking contrast is the size of his critical output from the same period, about 150 published reviews, articles, essays for Artforum, Art Week, Afterimage. So I'm just curious, if you could each speak to maybe writing something unpopular and why you might do that.
Evan, I'm going to start because at my age, I will
Please.
forget the question
Okay.
if you go first. So I don't want to forget the question. I think because you touched on Lou Thomas, Sarah, this is the perfect example, particularly because he became my significant mentor in the same way that Robert Flick, as my photography teacher, was my other mentor on so many things that carried on into my work. But Lou and I met because I wrote kind of a negative review of a show of his work. And I think this so epitomizes the 70s and how people talk to him. So he wrote me telling me I got it all wrong, but he wanted to meet me and he was appreciative that I tried. And that began this incredible relationship. And I can honestly say this work, I mean, it wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Lou. There's just no two ways about that. And but I think but this is the thing about the 70s and the freshness of it. And people were very candid and nobody was making any money. So you weren't risking anything if you spoke up. Uh, and people wanted you to speak up. And as I pointed out too, we had this amazing tabloid Art Week. It came out every week. And so you wrote your and your material was out there whenever you wrote, and then you were an opening where all these people had just read it. All of this happening within a 7 day period, and you talked about it, and you argued, and you fought, and it was very refreshing. And that went away in the 1980s, and I went away too because of that.
Evan, as a writer, does that make you wistful for an environment in which your writing might be received? Or how do you know?
I mean, yeah, in some ways. Well, I will say, I think, Hal, you're much tougher than me. Um, and I think also it's an expression of integrity because, you were writing at a time when okay, at a certain level, someone like Hilton Kramer, who was writing for the New York Times, might have had a more direct relationship on an artist's, market than any critic can now.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, you didn't have the what I think is sometimes a perverse incentive for writing negative criticism that it, kind of can exist as clickbait. I mean, I have found that it's more that it carries more effectively on the internet. I've tried to never let that steer me
Mhm.
as a critic, um, but I guess just the way that I read that in your work in your photo series is that um, they have such restraint. You know, um, they see there's no excess in them. And I think I just see work by artists all the time that really could easily be pared down, and there's such a kind of intensity of concept to them that is also really like immediately registered with the viewer. I mean, which isn't to say that they're not also very layered, but that to me strikes as something that, you know, criticism might have helped you get to know what to keep and what to leave out.
Actually, I think you really hit on something interesting, and on just prosaic level. When I started writing, I mean, it, you had word counts, and actually, so our week was fairly generous because it usually ran about 2.5 typewritten pages. But when I started writing for art forum, it was under 200 words, and so it was incredible training. And I was just writing about this for a piece, and I said, I didn't have the academic training to be a writer. I had had good writing training because both in high school and college, so I did know how to write, even though I didn't know I knew how to write until I tried to write, as a test case. But I said, you learn how to succinctly describe what you're seeing. You create a context for it, and I believe you offer an opinion. And so I learned very early on, particularly with art form, because he said,
In
"Oh,
200 words, you do that.
yeah. And you are not, particularly for art form, it was like, oh no, you don't get to just write about photography. You have to write about everything, all media." And in fact, I did one of the first reviews of Judy Chicago's Dinner Party because it premiered at SF MoMA, and I kind of took it apart. And it's interesting because I went back and read it, and I go, "Oh my God, I can't believe I wrote this." It was like not. I mean, the context, it was so grounded. I was like, where did I get this? How did I do this? But it is a formula, and I followed it. And I think because I had a certain degree of clarity, which I think I also have in my photography, I got a good readership because people understood what I was writing. They did not need to pull out a dictionary or not have any idea of what the person's talking about. And though I'm not here, I'm actually quite succinct when I have to be.
You're plenty
That's
to
so
say.
rare and so important.
Um, so let's talk a little bit about this book since we are in a photo book club. And I'd like to begin with the title, Seminal Works, because I know, Hal, you thought about other titles. And, I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Well, I think we need to acknowledge that I was in a very unique position with Aperture because I'm not one in my entire life and career for deferring. But I mean, the point about Aperture and the point of me knowing Aperture from the beginning of my photo career, and just knowing that Aperture is on this whole other level, um, I was willing to say, okay, let's just go for it. And if they say, no, we want to put this in, we want to do this. I mean, I never said no
I
because
know,
I
no,
thought,
you didn't, you never said no. That
yeah,
so
I thought, oh boy, we'll see where this
but are you
goes.
okay? Then maybe the better question is, I love the title. Do you?
Well, I do. I think the title works. It was not the first title that was proposed. I
Mm,
actually added works
yes.
because it was Hal Fischer Seminole, and I said, well, why don't you just cut to the chase and use X, which I will not say what X is, but it's if you take a few of the letters off Seminole.
Yeah.
And actually, Seminole and this other word do come from the same root.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I
Yeah, of
thought,
course.
okay. So we added
No,
work.
I agree. I think Seminole. Um,
My answer to when Brendan said it was, "Are you kidding me?"
well, but we appreciate you going along with it. So the book was designed by Scott Williams. And Scott Williams and his partner Hendrik have a design firm based in London called A2 SWHK. Um, they also design our magazine, and they've designed a handful of other books for Aperture. Uh, I think it's worth noting, just sort of materially, the book has this wonderful. It's a paper cover, but with the spot gloss on these portraits. And maybe you'll describe this. to me, what I liked about this is that somebody who doesn't know your work, who may not be thinking about the root of the word seminal, um, may pick this up and be kind of curious. Well, what is this project? A kind of surprising project for your career to have featured on the front and back cover.
Well, it's a miracle it's on the cover because the only reason there's a lot of work in the book would not have, because I didn't edit anything at the very beginning that I sent to Brendan. I didn't want to go through my files. So I had sent these large files, folders with just all these images that had been digitized years ago. And the next thing I'm seeing cover choices. Oh, we like this one. I said, well, that's a self-portrait of me in my underwear at 23,
We'll
which
get
they
to
did
that.
not realize, which was pretty hilarious. And this piece on the cover, uh, was done for it was commissioned by a woman who did color Xerox calendars and would, over a period of I don't know how long, commission hundreds of artists to do these things. And so the mock-up for this piece was one of the files I sent. And so when that comes back with, what do you think of this for the cover? I mean, I really had to do a lot of adjustment in my head because all of a sudden I'm looking at things that in a million years. And I think that though I didn't have to have, as I said, I was going to defer to Aperture. And I think what's interesting about the cover is, and I've seen this go both ways, that I think that on the bookshelf, I get it because I think it's so curious that people would pick up the book and look at it. On the other hand, people who are, and at one of the book launches, I noticed this. I don't want to stereotype, but I saw gay people walking right by the book signing because they did not connect this or the name with my work. Whereas if we had signifiers for male response or something on the cover, they would have stopped. But
Yep.
I think it was totally the right choice. I think, again, it's an intriguing cover.
And
But
you have such a great cult following. Our feeling was, how can we get somebody who could really, whose mind and worldview could be expanded by, hearing your voice, by reading your words, by seeing your art? Can we get somebody else to pick this up? And that was our thinking. To return though to the frontispiece of the book, um, Evan, perhaps you would like to speak to this work to a young this was before you were an undergraduate still here, right?
probably before he was born. Well, Evan
Well,
was
yeah.
born. Well, it's too bad Jared Ernst wasn't here to speak about it
Oh,
because the beginning of his essay,
well,
I mean,
by the way, we can
yeah,
do
I
that.
quote this all the time.
Introduction.
It's the only time in my
Yeah.
life I've been
Actually, I can
been
ask.
called lightly muscled.
Yes, here already. I'll read that part just so you can hear yourself described as lightly muscled. Up near the pillows, a lean young white man sits at the front edge of the mattress, feet on the floor and slightly open in a V shape. He leans forward, his lightly muscled arms pressed elbows to knees, framing the white curving seam over the crotch on his briefs. A silver bracelet glints on his thin wrist, his tousled flaxen hair in a cut reminiscent of David Cassidy and the Partridge Family, and the spare yet specific styling of the bedding, jewelry, underwear, in addition to the visual qualities of the photo itself, conspire to locate this otherwise timeless scenario squarely in the early 1970s. It's a pretty great writing.
Yeah, some of that's actually going to go in my obituary.
Yeah, okay.
Uh,
We'll
hopefully not too soon. As you can see, the
no,
lightly
not too soon.
tousled flaxen hair is long gone, as are the lightly muscled. But be that as it may, that is a picture from Pennsylvania in my bedroom. I was at Penn State working on a Rockefeller Fellowship that a professor of mine from the University of Illinois had gotten to go to Penn State and do this. And I was given non-degree graduate status. I got to study, but I think the most significantly in terms of my photography, and in the Pennsylvania section, is that I sort of got a really good uninterrupted period of time to really photograph. And I think that work in particular is very influenced by Robert Flick's Midwest Diary. But I was able to really sort of polish all aspects, my technique, my printing, my my vision, you know. And it's sort of shocking me because I wasn't at Penn State that long, but it was a period that, I mean, I got there, I think, somewhere in early spring 1974, and I left in December to come out and then go to San Francisco State. And I really got a lot done. It was a very influential period.
So maybe we'll
There,
talk a little bit about, oh, Evan, did you have something? Sorry, I don't want to.
no, I was just gonna say there are a couple there are a few photographs in those early works that suggest that you're really interested in the way that photographs and images are constructed. You know, some of them are gridded. There's a manipulation of chemical developer going on in a number of them. And then really interesting works with texts from newspapers about sometimes quite like gruesome events laid over very anodyne scenes of, you know, the kind of what do you call those machines that you know, you stick a quarter in and kids can ride outside the grocery store. And, you know, that's a kind of that's a semiotic play, you know, is this juxtaposition of exactly the missing children photograph. Thank you. Um, and yeah, I wonder if I know we spoke a little bit about how you came across Claude Levi Strauss and semiotics, but were you reading this kind of stuff at the time you were making these works, or this just sort of entered your practice by another route?
Well, it's really by another route. And I mean, it's an interesting route because, you know, when I got to San Francisco, I didn't know what I was going to do in terms of photography. And I realized in reading some journals, I think that's can be really typical of a lot of artists because I was talking about my teachers at that point, Don Worth and Jack Welpott talking like, just take it easy, don't worry, you know. Um, but I had been working with the idea of not even text, but something written all the way back into college where I was making sculpture and embedding written words in resin. So this was the thing to me. And there's some very early Illinois work. There's two pieces where you'll see where I was, writing on the photograph. I was photographing off the TV, which I think was very much the influence of having seen Robert Heineken's photos. But when I was stymied, Robert, at that point, who lived in LA and was teaching at USC, said to me, sort of, try using bleach. So I started taking images, and this really tapped into something because I originally had wanted to be a painter, but my dean at the University of Illinois said, no, you're going into graphic design. So I was into this. But the big difference, and this is where loop between that work from 74 and then what Sarah just showed from 1975 is that my interventions with grids with writing was intuitive. I mean, clearly I was not happy just making a photograph. I had to do something to it. And I think that's the painterly impulse. But like the spaceship, which you mentioned, photo, the text is about a kidnapping of all these school children in Chowchilla in California, and they all disappeared, the whole school bus. So I was kind of like oh, here's a mysterious object, the spaceship, which is an icon, and I think icons run through all of my work.
Mhm.
Um, but that was what happened when I met Lou Thomas. He saw what I was doing and he redirected me. He didn't, he started giving me intellectual context and things to read. And so Gay Semiotics shows the difference of, I think, a much more critically rigorous approach to this. So there was no longer intuitive. It became a very direct relationship. And in each piece, text photos in a Gay Semiotics boyfriend's cassette, I use text in each one in a very different way, but
Mhm.
each one is critically informed. And that's not true of the earlier work.
Um, should we talk about how you use text in each one? Maybe it's a good idea to sort of um to dive into some of these. You're actually a consummate craftsman in addition to being so thoughtful. And I think that's actually a rare combination. Often artists are very interested in one or the other, sort of the materiality and the physical presence, or the impetus or the thoughts behind it. And you really do both. Do you want to speak a little bit about some of those different relationships of text and image?
Sure. And I think you alluded to something that I think is important. People that were doing conceptually based photography were largely indifferent to craft. Now, there are exceptions.
Right.
Robert Cumming is a major exception to that. Beautiful prints, but largely they weren't. And a lot of the people that were doing that I knew had not come out of a photography program. And I had really developed that. But an important part of gay semiotics is there was an argument. Well, at that point in time, there were arguments about everything. But if people were doing conceptual photography, Lou Thomas in particular would be challenged. He said, "You're a conceptual artist. You're not a photographer." Conceptual. So for me, one of the main things was to figure out how to get the text into the photo, not on a label next to it,
Mhm,
not on
mhm.
anything else. And I did that by using really a 19th century technique, which was just to write or use type on acetate, put it over the paper, you know, expose the paper through it, and where there was writing or words would be blocked out and would be white. So that was a real important thing to me. Um, I would
Had you seen, sorry, can I just ask one question? Had you seen anyone doing this? Like, was it a remnant of teaching that made you
no,
think of this? Like,
no,
or were you trying to just solve a problem and you
I
like,
was Yeah. And I mean, there was a good guide because you look at a lot of 19th century photos and there's an identification on them of place, or you think of
yeah,
old
that's how they
postcards.
sign their names to it.
And
Yeah.
they had to be writing on the glass in those days. That's the only
Okay.
way they could have
Yeah.
done that. So it's a very convenient way. Um, but getting back to the real
Okay.
question you asked is that to me, um, gay semiotics of 24 photos, that really is conceptual photography. That is what it is. And it's very strategic for me in terms of I was making photographs that I often call them banal, but I think I'm going to be nicer to myself. They were drawn off of the idea of vernacular imagery. They're very non-threatening. I think that for people, they would have a certain kind of familiarity because they kind of have a fashion photography, advertising. And again, think about the days where we read newspapers. And so people were very black and white images in newspapers. So it was that level, but it was a strategy because the photograph, you'd go look at the photograph, come up, and the text was the size, so you saw the photograph, and then you had to get up a little pretty close to read the text, and then you go, "Oh, look at what I'm reading about," and then the more salacious ones end with a joke. Uh, kind of the whole a very Jewish humor thing, which is addressed in the essays in the book. So
Yeah, and
one
I,
of the
I think
rules there.
actually it's worth pausing on. I'll just read. So may I quote you to yourself or to everyone here? Because I think these signifier they are informative, they are smart, and they are funny. So for instance, about red handkerchief here. Red handkerchiefs are used as signifiers for behavior that is often regarded as deviant or abnormal. A red handkerchief located in the right hip pocket implies that the wearer takes a passive role in anal/hand insertion. A red handkerchief placed in the left hip pocket suggests that the wearer plays the active role in anal/hand insertion. Red handkerchiefs are also employed in the treatment of nasal discharge and in some cases may have no significance in regard to sexual contact. You know,
There you got it.
there you
Um,
got it. You
and
could just have a cold and have a
yeah,
handkerchief in your back pocket.
I mean, it does raise some interesting issues just about signifiers and their significance and when they're not signifiers, because it's the context that really matters and determines a lot. But so that, and Semiotics is 24 works. It did not start out with, oh, this is what I'm doing. I mean, there was a very pragmatic thing. I had a show scheduled, my first one-person show in San Francisco for 24 photographs. So I started that and I just kept building out from it. And then I hit 24 and stopped. And then, the next year I did Castro Street. And so if we put gay semiotics in the category of conceptual photography, Castro Street is a documentary, but it's using new forms or a new way of looking at the document. And I got to say, I'm really proud of Castro Street. And before the Thought Pieces exhibition at SF MoMA that opened in uh, early 2020, unfortunate timing with the pandemic, but
Great show.
people haven't seen Castro Street. There had been a small book of it, but the book sold out. I mean, even scholars didn't know about the book. And it hadn't been shown since 1981. And so there was in two books, it just didn't register. But once it got up on the wall and people started responding to it, and I thought more about it. Um, it is what Aaron O'Toole told me is a durational performance piece because it's me standing in one place, trying to take the same photograph every hour on the hour. And that was a performative aspect, but that's also, I mean, a little bit of a conceptual thing because I'm going to make the exact same photo, or attempt to.
Mhm.
It's not as easy as it seems. Um, and then the text is really dealing with the other 59 minutes. And so, unlike gay semiotics, which has an element of autobiography, if you really dig into it, whether it's autobiography of desire or play or whatever. But I am in Castro Street. And I was very influenced in the text by Robbe-Grillet's Notes for a New Novel and things, because it's not using metaphor, not, being very direct. The text was created in a way that the text had equal weight to the photo. It's not a caption. And still to this day would say, oh, can we run this cap? I said, that is not a caption, excuse me. But I'm actually really proud of that work because the more I think about it, it's a document of the Castro at a particular period of time in a way that no one else saw it. And it encompasses everything from who's cruising to, the last remnants of the old guard of the working class that lived in the neighborhood. And Miriam Kashani talks a bit about it in her essay because she grew up in San Francisco and about what it was like to go to the Castro as a teenager. So um, I'm really actually very proud of that piece because it's not like somebody and other photographers go, oh, I'm going to go photograph, the guys in drag over here. I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. It's a whole period of time that I
Yeah,
think brings in so much of what was going on in the neighborhood.
yeah.
So it's autobiographical, but it's much further than autobiographical. And I think that also carries into my boyfriend's piece, which for some people is a really difficult piece. So while I would say gay semiotics is conceptual, Castro Street is documentary and performative. And I was reviewing and seeing a lot of performance art, by the way, at that point, because that was a very big thing in that period and in San Francisco, where you had Ant Farm and all these other groups doing some really major stuff. However, Boyfriends, I talk about as a piece of appropriation because I never made a photograph for Boyfriends. What I did was I went through my contact sheets and looked at various people I had slept with from the perspective of what does my interaction with them typify? What does it say about, hey, how gay men were meeting, what they were doing? And so that's what I did. And, it's not definitive because I could have done probably 50 more pictures. It's selected, it's curated. And the text is really how do I take that interaction and make it into an archetype? and I have fun with it. I've labeled it. There's a code number, which actually is about the year it was made, the place it was made, and what number it is in my contact sheets.
Okay, I
So,
was wondering what the code was.
but
Okay.
that again goes back to this. I like things that I don't quite understand sometimes, like drawing diagrams on the later work. And so, boyfriends is a weird kind of appropriation, and in a way of still learning things about my work. I was writing something the other day for a magazine, and I'd never thought about that the black bands over the eyes are signifiers. And I was like, oh my God, you know, this is a universally used, at least in Western culture, for something that should be hidden, not revealed, or as a list, for whatever reason. Let's put it, it denotes something that cannot be shown. And I thought, wow, that's actually pretty interesting. And the other thing in Boyfriends, because you can see in each of these pieces, I'm grappling, how do I present the text? And in Boyfriends, each of the texts is actually its own photograph. So, and you can see that in the book because
Hmm.
they have equal weight. And
Yep.
that, you know, and this starts to get into,
Each have a border. Right.
yeah, and so this actually gets into a kind of struggle that I think a lot of conceptual photographers had. My colleague Donna Lee Phillips and even Lou, that there was almost this tension between communicating ideas between photographs and text. And we all, the three of us, all, I mean, Lou really delved much more deeply into publishing. Donna Lee started writing and was doing less photography. I think writing kind of just became the more efficient and powerful and direct way to get your ideas across for a lot of us. You know, um, and so
Yeah.
that's what happened.
So maybe to turn back to one piece of the book, because I one of the things I also love is that the front and the back, the pages are all this beautiful gray, photographic gray, all of nuance. And the in those though, there are a handful of color pictures and others that show up well. And this, Evan, maybe this is a trio of pictures, Bad Bunny, Timothy Chalamet, and Harry Styles. Um, as speaking of combinations of words and pictures, and Evan, do you remember, I know you and Hal talked about this in your interview, but when did you see these when they first came out I'd love to hear you
In the
speak
New York
to,
Times,
yeah.
yeah. I thought it was a brilliant commission, whoever had the idea to ask you to do that, and they're very lucky that that you accepted. It reminded me also of a
Evan, will you just describe the series for people who just looked at it quickly but might not know beyond
um
here? It's
yeah.
on page, for anyone who's working at home, it's on page 19.
Well, I want to pull it up myself if I
Yeah.
may.
Yeah.
Um, but uh, but essentially, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, but you applied this signifiers for a male response rubric to these three celebrities as kind of archetypes of heterosexual masculinity. It reminded me of a meme that I saw a year or two ago, which showed on the one hand it said gays in 2024, and it showed a guy wearing Carhartt and a tank top, and then straight men in 2024, and it was a photograph of Harry Styles in a full glam rock outfit, which seemed quite accurate. um and that humor definitely seemed to be baked into to yeah to your
Did you
version.
see that when those were in the New York Times? Like, in other words, before you were talking, and did you recognize it as a Hal work, I presume? But
Oh yeah,
yeah.
immediately.
How did that commission come about?
Well, I will, because you asked Devin if he recognized it. There were a number of people who got very irate because they thought the New York Times had ripped off my style until they read the bio. And since I actually hadn't made photographs in 40 years, and probably a lot of people didn't even think I was alive, it was a bit of a shock. Um, It came about because the photo editor, the picture editor for T Magazine, contacted me
Hmm.
about this commission, and it was quite a ride. I mean, it was so it was it was illustrating an article on queer baiting, the theme being the whole issue of ostensibly straight man doing things to appeal to the queer community, of which I think there's a certain degree of outrage. I mean, the way it works is um, somebody, a Bad Bunny, since he's in the news, his backup singer woman kissed him, so he turned around and kissed the male backup singer. And then what happens each of these times is 2 days later, the PR people have something out that he's not gay. And this is very consistent, whether you're talking about James Franco or talking to whoever. Um, so that was the context. And this was back, I think this was, and they told me this is who they wanted me to use. I at that point didn't even know who Bad Bunny was because this is a few years ago. And they hired me because they really, I mean, it was, can you do this the way you did your street fashion work in gay semiotics? Um, it got pretty interesting, but the idea was that I would label things. Uh, and what I was actually doing is calling out things that are traditionally apparel, accoutrements that are traditionally seen as being of the female gender, worn by these male personalities. Um, and then one of the things, a term that had been used at one point in this is, and really shaped me, is because I like to label things. So at the bottom of those pictures, it says performative queerness. And then I gave them, just as I did street fashion, I labeled each of them with whatever I thought they were. Um,
Still with the acetate sleeve, or they're
oh,
digital?
no, 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 God, thank God. No, I didn't take these pictures. I mean, these were all stock photos. So there were parameters about what could be used. I mean, it's really funny. Maybe someday I'll write a little satirical piece about working with the New York Times because it was a wild ride. I can only say not they weren't all on the same page because one was like, "Oh, do we have to have the words on the photos?" I thought that's why you commissioned me. Uh, I got into one great conversation with the editor. I mean, at this point, it had really taken a long time to find the photos and get them to work. And I think because the New York Times had not dealt with this kind of stuff before, it was very confusing. It's like, well, we don't retouch, we don't do anything. Well,
You're like, well,
okay, well, this moved into a whole other realm because those photos are composites of several photos and they are all heavily retouched. So, like, okay, this one from the Bad Bunny we want to use. Well, we have to take the Grammy out of his hand. So we had people in New York doing all of that.
all right.
Yeah, so it was really
Well,
interesting.
it was I'm glad it's in the book, even if only as a text figure. So as we're closing up, there are two things that I'd like to ask each of you to respond to. Um, and the first is about nostalgia, because I think each of you from different generations, I'd just love to hear you think through the question of nostalgia with your work, sort of its appeal and how it functions, and maybe how we'll start with you and then we'll ask, well, actually either one can go first. I'm equal. Whichever, but I do think, at one point you had been thinking of this book with a very nostalgic title, and there is certainly a wistfulness for a time past, um, that I would be interested to hear each of you speak to.
Evan, you want to go?
Oh gosh. Well, I remember we spoke a bit about this idea that these photographs, that your work documents a kind of a gay golden age, and that you weren't always necessarily comfortable with that suggestion, or it never feels like a golden age when you're in the middle of it. And I mean, it does register that way to me. And I think I was so drawn to the work when I first saw it because I connected to literature that I was reading, to, it's a world that I was trying to access that wasn't immediately available to me. I was just, and I'm not to point anyone back to this because it was written a long time ago, and I'd make some edits now. But I was just revisiting that piece that I wrote back in 2015 when I first saw your work, and I wrote that the black and white images of mustachioed leather men in high-waisted flare jeans might feel a little dated, maybe because cruising has gone digital. In today's gayborhoods, though, uniforms have changed, but they're still in fashion. Fisher's exhibition is actually timely. It makes us ask how our rapidly evolving hookup culture has changed the way we communicate and express ourselves in public spaces. Um, Now, there are many different things that I could say about the timeliness of a work like Castro Street, which brings up um, uh, questions of gentrification and urban change and the loss of the textures and identity of a neighborhood in San Francisco today, for instance. That makes me nostalgic, both for San Francisco as a city that I know a bit and love, and other places I've lived like New York or London. So um, yeah, I guess nostalgia operates in a few different ways in your
Mhm.
work for me.
I think that the thing using the word nostalgia, I mean, it's interesting because I guess I would question, can people be nostalgic for something that they didn't live through? So I use the word, we all use the word. I don't know if it's the right word, but um, I think that there are people looking back at an era that is very attractive because there appeared to be a lot of liberation. It was on so many levels a simpler time for everybody, and the community was cohesive in a way. And so, when we first brought this work back in the public, I was really worried because it is gay white male culture. And I addressed that in the essay that I wrote because I felt
Very thoughtfully.
people needed to know that I knew that, what this issue was. But I think people are celebrating that time just because what it meant to be post-liberation and pre-AIDS, and the freedom, and the people were outside. They weren't sitting at their computers looking up. They were outside. Everybody was out. And we had these telepathic connections. Oh my God, we're having a protest march. There's no internet. There's no computer. Somehow everybody knows to be there. And so I think there's this really interesting thing that people miss these things. It's just like I think when Castro came into existence, a lot of the older people that were on Polk Street didn't necessarily like this new visibility. They liked their community in these dark bars with no windows. Um, and you can get into the whole thing of repression or separation and how it brings you together as a community. And I don't joke about the queer community, but I'd go, oh my God, the tent is so big, with as we add more acronyms and more people. It I have to question to me how significant it is because it's just so big. It's just the other, you know. So this was a much easier time to define and experience.
Well, I think you defined it in a way that is really singular, and we're happy to have had an opportunity to bring them together in this book. So, thank you so much, Evan. Thank you, above all, Hal. It has been a pleasure speaking with you both. To Brianna and Alex, my colleagues, to Clark from Candle Productions for the production, and to Photo Focus, and to all of you for joining in. We really appreciate it. Tune in again. I can't remember what the next date of ours is, but we'll let you know. Sign up for the Aperture PhotoBook Club. Tell your friends. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks
Thank
all.
you so much.
Thanks.